goal of this video is to familiarize the audience with how UCS Director can be used to automate ACI. UCS Director can be used to create an ACI tenant and the networking constructs for an application profile for both the virtual and physical workloads. We can see that one of the problems we have in networking is that developers create apps and they assume network connectivity, and it is the network engineer's job to actually fit those workloads securely into the network. If we look at the timeline to get a 3-tier app onto the network, we have to design the VRFs, the VLANs, and the subnets, which will typically take 1 to 2 weeks. Make the configuration changes to the network switches in VMware, another 2 weeks. We need to implement the firewall rules to secure the application, another 1 to 2 weeks. And then of course we have the change control process, which could take up to 2 weeks. So typically ETA for the application live on the network is going to be approximately 5 to 8 weeks. What we're going to show you in this demonstration is how we're going to integrate UCS Director and ACI to create that 3-tier app using what we call catalog items in ACI. ACI uses a northbound API to talk down to the infrastructure, and UCS Director uses a REST API to talk to APIC. So in summary, we can see that we can deploy applications and services faster. We can reduce the application development to production cycle times and mitigate security and compliance risk. If we look at the contacts here, any one of these folks can help you talk more about this demonstration or any other demonstrations that you have seen tonight. In today's demonstration, we're going to be talking about a product called UCS Director, and we are going to take a look at how we can use UCS Director to manage our physical as well as virtual infrastructure inside of our data centers. When we first log into UCS Director, we are presented with a summary view, and this gives us a really good glimpse into our physical and virtual infrastructure. We see up on the top we have our virtual infrastructure, so our vCenter, and we can see trending going on for our CPU and memory going up. We can look at our storage infrastructure. In this case, we're looking at a NetApp filer. We can look at our storage data store sizes. We can also look at our UCS server inventory. And then finally, at the very end, we can actually do some chargeback, so we can look at how much this infrastructure is actually costing us. If we look at our converged infrastructure, we can drill into UCS Director and actually look directly into our virtual infrastructure. Just like we saw in our summary view from the main page, each one of these infrastructure views gives us a summary view as well. So again, we can see the trending, and any one of these graphs can actually be exported up to the dashboard when you first log in. One of the things that most customers really like to see is something called Stack View. And what Stack View allows us to do is look at a physical, or actually I should say a virtual client, and then do a stack view of it. So once we have the stack view come up, we can see all the different parameters that make up a virtual machine. So we can see the OS. In our case, this is a Linux OS. We can look at the VM name as well as the IP address of the VM, the network adapter, the hard disk that's applied to it. And then when we start really drilling into it, this is where the troubleshooting portion of this really shines. So we can look at what data store this particular virtual machine is on, what ESXi host it's on, what blade or chassis based server it's on, as well as what vCenter it's on. So from a single pane of glass, we can actually look at the components that make up a virtual machine, and this is a really nice view for the administrator of your data center to take a look at when they're troubleshooting. And we can go back in, we can take a look at our NetApp filer, and again we get the summary view just like we had in all the other ones. We can take a look at the aggregates that are on the filer, the volumes, the different LUNs, and I could actually go in and create a boot LUN right from this infrastructure. The next thing we want to look at is something called chargeback. Chargeback gives us the ability to put a price on CPU, memory, disk, and network per VM, and then we can use that to actually look and see what it's actually costing us to run our data center. So once we have these chargeback costs, we can actually run reports, and we can see by virtual machine how many hours that virtual machine is up and actually what it's costing us. This gives us the ability to go back to the business unit and actually charge them for a particular virtual machine. The next thing we want to look at is orchestration. So we know that we can manage the entire physical and virtual infrastructure, and what that allows us to do is then use automation and orchestration workflows to manage and automate that infrastructure. So we're going to look at an automation package that comes by default in UCS Director, and basically what we're going to do is we're going to add an ACI tenant. So if we open this workflow up, we take a look at workflows. They are processed from the top down, so it's a step-by-step type workflow. So ACI tenant, the next step would be to create the private network, the bridge domain, the application profile, the endpoint group, as well as add the contracts to the connectivity between the endpoint groups. So once these different workflows are created, we can then expose those workflows in something called a catalog item. So catalog items are created either through a workflow or through some other process where we can just add a catalog item. Could be a standard one, and that just might be to create an image of a server, or we could do advanced workflows where we're actually going to build out an ACI tenant. In our case, we have created multiple workflows. We have a workflow that will add an ACI tenant and remove an ACI tenant, as well as build a Linux box that we can apply to that tenant. So the next step, what we want to do is we want to log in as a demo user to use some of these workflows. For the next section of this demonstration, we're going to log into UCS Director as a demo user. This user will have less permissions than the normal admin, and he will only be presented with catalog items that allow him to create and delete an ACI tenant, as well as deploy a Linux virtual machine into the ACI tenant networking infrastructure. So we're going to log in as Demo 1, who is a user in the engineers group that has access to those catalog items. Again, once we log in, we can see we have a whole lot less things we can choose from in the GUI. So what we're going to do is we're going to log into the Advanced tab, and we're going to add an ACI tenant. Going to click Next, and we're going to name the tenant Acme-Demo. The private network is called Acme. The profile is Acme-Web. The bridge domain is Acme-BD. And then we're going to create 3 endpoint groups called Web, App, and DB for database. Going to click Next and Submit. Now once we kick this off, we can look through it in the Services tab. So if we open up the Services tab, we can look at the details. We can see we're creating the ACI tenant. We're going to be creating the virtual private network and the bridge domains. So if we actually look in ACI, we can now see that the Acme demo tenant has been created. And we can kind of follow along as these networking constructs are being built out. Okay, we can see the application profile has been built. The EPG web has been built. And again, as this builds it out, as the workflow actually builds out the networking, it uses API calls to ACI, and then ACI will then talk down to vCenter to create. And now that we can see that the contracts have been created to allow inter-EPG communication. And if we go back to UCS Director, we can see it's now finished. So again, if we look at the vSphere web client, if we look at the networking, we can see the port groups that are created. Now, port groups are mapped to EPG, so we should see the port groups of app, web, and database that were created. So here we go, Acme Demo, Acme Web Application, and app. So now that we've created the networking constructs using the UCS Director workflow, we are now going to use the standard workflow catalog item to create a Linux server. So we're going to double click that, click next. We're going to provision it from the Silver Virtual Data Center, and we're going to give it a name of wwt-test1. Again, I can provision it now or later. Okay, I can give it a lease time of days and hours, and in my case, I just want to provision it. I'm going to click next. And now if you notice, there's NIC aliases. So these are actually the endpoint groups or port profiles that were created in vCenter for me to choose to place my VM in. In this case, I'm going to be building a web server, so I don't need the NICs to be in the database or the app EPG, so I'm going to remove those. And again, if I was building a database server, I would choose the database NIC to place that in the database endpoint group. If I was building an app server, I would use the app endpoint group to place that web server or that app server inside of the app EPG. Again, we could choose how many CPU cores or how much memory we wanted to provision. And if you notice, we have a cost associated with how long it's going to take to run that VM. Click the port group and submit. Click next and submit. So again, we can now go into services and watch the VM being deployed. Now, one of the nice things about UCS Director is we can actually put an approval process in. So this way it would get to this approval if there was one, and an email would get kicked off to the end user's manager, and then that person could then approve or deny his provisioning of a virtual machine into the infrastructure. In our case, we're not going to use the approval process. And now it will start to copy the virtual machine from a template in vCenter. And we should be able to see that getting kicked off. And finally, now that we can see that once the machine has been cloned from a template, it is then put into the web endpoint group in ACI, and that allows us to have full connectivity into our ACI infrastructure. So that concludes this demonstration of how we can deploy ACI using UCS Director and then apply a virtual machine into the UCS Director infrastructure.